We're here today with Dr. Holly Geyer. She is an internal medicine and addiction medicine specialist. She is also a national speaker on the topics of opioids and addiction, and she's authored over 120 different publications. She is also the author of the leading patient-focused book, Ending the Crisis, Mayo Clinic's Guide to Opioid Addiction and Safe Opioid Use. We're so happy to have you here today.
This is wonderful. Thank you for having me here, Kim.
Well, we're going to start off with a pretty straightforward topic, and that's trying to understand this issue of opioids, because we're all hearing about it in the news. We've all heard about the crisis, but there's a lot of misinformation out there about, the good, the bad, the indifferent, and all of that. So maybe we can talk a little bit about, why we ended up in this crisis and how we can end it. And I guess let's just go back to the beginning. So let's talk about the history of this crisis. How did we get to where we are today?
It's a mess out there, my goodness. And this is not our first rodeo, I hate to say it, Kim. America's been struggling with opioids for generations. And what we're seeing right now is really a 30-year-long span of something that's been recurrent over and over in our history. If I were to take us all the way back to like the mid-1800s, when heroin and laudanum and other medications were pretty freely distributed both within the medical community and homeopathic industries to treat a bazillion ailments, people realized all the way back then there's something different about this drug class. There's a potential for it to do something to our mind and our bodies that is very different than many other drugs that we offer for pain relief. So around the early 20th century, the Harrison Act really outlawed these drugs from a federal perspective and said, listen, this is something only prescribers should be offering. And that eradicated a lot of these drugs from the street. The problem is we saw resurgences of opioid-related epidemics with each of our major wars, the 1940s and then the 1950s and the 1970s. And the themes are the same. We give these medications oftentimes for great indications. They're used right and they're used appropriately, and then they cause problems. And we don't necessarily know how to deal with those well, way back then. And that's why we kept seeing these down or decreases in their usage patterns until about the 1980s. I will say, prior to the 1980s, for the most part, prescribed opioids were rare outside of uses for cancer or major health indications. But this article came out in the New England Journal of Medicine, and for our audience, that's a very prominent medical journal, very reputable. And it's this 5-line retrospective article where someone had gone back and looked through a couple thousand patients and said, listen, out of all these patients that we've looked back through who received an opioid, we only see something like 4 or 5 of them had evidence of addiction by the end of their opioid treatment. From this, we can confidently conclude that use of opioids in a prescribed manner doesn't lead to addiction. Boom. This caught on like wildfire within the industry. And as you can imagine, the pharmaceutical industry took off with this concept, and it was cited hundreds of times in major publications to really relay the fact that we don't believe prescribed opioids are going to carry with them the negative consequences of the illicit use of drugs like heroin or things we find on the streets. And so with this, prescribing patterns went up amongst clinicians. We started writing more liberally. The federal government and some major organizations within the medical industry caught on to this concept and said, well, maybe we should be using them more liberally, and maybe we should write this into guidelines. And so we had the American Pain Association and the VA, and then ultimately regulatory authorities start recommending that we liberalize their use. And we created pain as the 5th vital sign. For our audience, we have 4 major vital signs, the heart rate and the blood pressure and the respiratory rate and oxygenation. These are objective, well-identified, really non-arguable identifiers in a human when we're looking for evidence of pathology. But pain is subjective. And when we're routinely assessing a patient for pain, are they really experiencing what you and I would experience for the same ailment at the level they're giving us? We all have heard that, scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being your arm being bit off by a dinosaur and 1 being you stub your toe. Your 10 might be very different than my 10. And if I had $1 for every time I had a patient who's playing Candy Crush in a 12 out of 10 pain, I'd be rich. So you can imagine the consequences of including requirements to assess that pain level in virtually every patient now at a federal level. There's a major organization called the Joint Commission, and this is a survey organization that essentially oversees the healthcare industry in terms of quality and standardization of patient practices. And they built in this concept of pain being adequately managed and measured in every patient. And then CMS, the Center for Medicaid Services and Medicare Services, came along and said, well, maybe we should be doing this routinely in every patient. And all of a sudden, we've got all of these regulatory groups monitoring how often we're assessing and making sure patients are having it assessed and managed to their satisfaction. Then they tied it to reimbursement. And if that patient didn't feel like their pain was being well managed, if it wasn't to their satisfaction, we get dinged as a hospital and as a provider. So now, all of a sudden, my livelihood is tied to how well my patient's pain is managed. And if that 12 out of 10 Candy Crush pain isn't to their satisfaction, I do it, at higher and higher doses until they are satisfied. So you can see this regulatory agency with the legal requirements and then this goal of us making enough income to reimburse our practices all spiraling out of control. And at the same time, we've got the drug companies mass marketing these concepts, targeting providers through marketing campaigns that have been since identified as fraudulent. They were standing outside with drug reps next to gas stations where physicians would go to, and they would pump your gas while talking to you about their new drug X, Y, or Z. They were flying physicians across the world for elaborate vacations, who knows where, if you were willing to prescribe the drug. If you give a talk on behalf of the organization, $25,000 in your pocket. You put us all this together, and it was a incredible, complex interaction of negative dynamics that really took us to the point where in 2015, 1 out of every 3 American adults got a bottle of pills of opioids. Imagine that. Now, prescribing peaked at around 2012 when the light bulb went on in the medical community, and we're starting to see all these negative complications from opioids come out. We're seeing addiction, we're seeing overdoses, we're seeing a neonatal withdrawal syndrome where the baby has essentially developed dependency on the drug. All of this stuff, and we really taper our prescribing patterns. But the cat was out of the bag. And by that point, we were already in the midst of this overprescribing crisis, which has since led to what we are now, the overdose crisis.
Well, you bring up something about this issue of pain, and I'll never forget over the years, when they talked about it, it was different. And suddenly the language changed to this issue of, well, we want to get you ahead of the pain. So even if you weren't in pain, I remember distinctly going in for something, and they said, well, here's this prescription, and you need to take it even if you don't feel the pain. Is this part of what happened with the change in how they were thinking?
Absolutely, yeah. This concept of staying ahead of the pain was part of that whole 1990s to early 2000s mentality. And again, it was marketed by drug companies as something safe to do, so why would you let your patient suffer if it really doesn't have any consequences? The problem is it does. We have since revised that language across America, and opioids are now second or third line management techniques in most situations, or paired with other non-opioid pharmacologics as that first line approach.
So as we look at this, I guess the question is what makes opioids so addictive? I mean, we know now, based on what's come out and the lawsuits, the settlements, everything is clearly pointing to the fact that original conversation about it not being addictive is clearly not the case. So, what is it that makes these so addictive?
Kim, we've realized for a long time, opioids are a very unique drug class. We've got a lot of different drugs available out there to help treat pain, but there's something different about opioids. And one of the most revolutionary reasons that they're beneficial is because we already make them. All day long, we're producing what we call endogenous opioids, or the ones that are produced in our own system. And they go up, they are produced in a variety of circumstances, one of which is when we experience pain. When we have pain, we need a way to tone down that volume of the pain. And so our body makes these opioids. They bind to receptors both out in the periphery of the body as well as our central nervous system to help alleviate that. They also go up when we do everyday happy activities, right? We take our dogs for a walk, or we hear some fun music, or eat ice cream. They go up, and the way they work for that pleasure sensation is they bind to a very specific part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. And I want our audience to know that word today, if they remember nothing else. The nucleus accumbens is our pleasure center, because when those opioids bind in that pleasure center to the receptors, they release a neurotransmitter in our brain called dopamine. Dopamine is our happy chemical. It's what goes up when we do everyday pleasurable activities. Things like taking our dog for a walk, hugging our kids, eating ice cream. We get a little bit of a surge. And that surge goes up slightly, temporarily, and comes right back down. The point of all that is to have us repeat everyday pleasurable activities, right? Things that allow us to produce and to go through life naturally, to be productive, to repeat things that are beneficial to us. The problem is with opioids, those drugs can hijack that neurotransmitter pathway and give us extremely high levels of that dopaminergic surge. Now imagine what happens to the brain when that happens over and over, day after day, hour after hour, year after year. We see tremendous changes in the brain, and I would encourage our audience to listen to the section that we have on the neurobiology that drives addiction, because it very well explains why people change on opioids over time, what makes them different about drug classes. But at the end of the day, if the drug is causing more problems than it causes benefits, it's time we take a look at it, and that's exactly what we've had to do in society with the opioid drug class.
So maybe just to kind of wrap up this first part in understanding, the addictive nature of this, is maybe talk about the difference between dependency on a drug and essentially addiction, because I'm fairly certain that anybody can become dependent on a drug, but not everybody kind of ends up going down the road of being at the point where, they start having certainly negative consequences in their life and an inability basically to not do this.
I think you're highlighting a really important point. The concept of dependency, especially what we call physiologic dependency or a bodily dependency, is essentially that the body is so normalized to having that drug or chemical in its system that when the drug is no longer there, two things happen. You can go through withdrawals or you develop tolerance to that drug, meaning you need higher and higher doses over time to achieve the same effect. Tolerance and withdrawal can happen with many different drugs that we offer, right? Blood pressure drugs, things like that are known for these side effect profiles. A physiologic dependency on the drug is very different than what we often see in addiction. Addiction is a behavioral phenomenon because the drug of abuse essentially takes control over that person. So control is one feature, cravings, consequences with it can all be manifestations of being addicted to the chemical. Now, more often than not, when someone's got a problem with addiction, they are also physiologically dependent on the drug. They will likely experience withdrawals to that or higher and higher doses being necessitated. But it's very important to separate out both because people can take the drugs legitimately over long periods of time, not have problems with addiction, but still be dependent on that opioid class.
Well, we've gone over the history of how all this got started, kind of how we got to where we are, and what makes these opioids so addictive. And we're going to continue on in this series by talking about more about what happens, like why we ended up with all these individuals overdosing and all of that. But that's for another segment, and so we really appreciate you coming and talking about this. So thank you so much.
Pleasure to be with you, Kim. Thank you.
Thank you.